Hello, and welcome back to our last week with the Birchbark House. And this story by Louise Erdrich is about Omakayas, a little girl who is 7 and 8 as we read along. Um, and she is a member of the of an Anishinaabe tribe which is quite far away from Oregon. It is on the Great Lakes, and their lives were so much different than the lives we live today. Where we are at the Mildred Whipple Library, we live on the lands that belonged to the Kalapuya tribes, where their lives were also very different from the lives we live today. But it's really fun to read about the ways that children played before we had uh, Nintendo Switch. Uh, and some of those toys that Omakayas and her brother and sister would have played with, you can pick up still at the library in craft kits. Some hard things happen too. Maybe some hard things have happened in your family, I'm sure. Uh, when we left off reading in winter, the family had a visitor, and it was a very exciting time. And everyone went into what's called a dance lodge and built a fire and had music, and they all danced and had a wonderful visit. But unfortunately, that visitor brought sickness, and the sickness stayed with the family, and everyone was very ill in the middle of winter. And the Old Tallow came to help to care for them, and Omakayas helped to care for her brothers and her sister and her parents. Uh, Unfortunately, of course, her baby brother, you may have read along. We didn't read that aloud, but her baby brother did die, and that was a tragedy and very difficult for the family to recover from. We're going to read a little bit of spring today, and if you are able to get to the library, there are still some craft kits. You can learn about beading, and you can still make a calendar stick or a buzzing toy. Today, it is maple sugar time. Everyone in the cabin heard it, the far off creaking and groaning, the boom of lake ice. The lake had started to move again. The ice was breaking up. Once the waves began, huge sheets of ice shoved against each other, pushing towers into the air. Nokomis, Mama, Day Pinch, Angeline, and Omakayas all ran outside, gazed on the horizon, and saw the crackling and snapping waves of the ice. They felt the surge of lake water in their blood. They knew at last that the back of winter was entirely broken. Omakayas grinned. Her smile was now whole. New teeth had grown in over the winter. She was older. Soon, spring plants would poke up through dead leaves. The curled heads of ferns, buds, roots, fresh new leaves. Fat lake trout would sleepily rise from the bottom, hungry to be caught. Siskoet and whitefish would fill their nets. They would be able to think of something other than the next bite of food. They would live again, truly live. Angeline went to the mission school every day now. She was learning to write her name in the white man's language, and she taught Omakayas the things she learned. Using a pointed stick to write in wet mud, Angeline showed Omakayas and Nokomis the meaningful signs, which looked like odd tracks. What animal would leave these? Omakayas teased. Be patient, Nokomis counseled. Let's find out what your sister has learned. They're letters, Angeline said, eager to share her knowledge. One follows the next. You look at them, just like tracks. You read them. They have a meaning and a sound. Oh, that's a good idea, like our picture writing, Nokomis said. The girls knew people like Fishtail's father, Day Thunder, who kept the records for the religious gatherings, the Midawewin, and etched stories and songs on scrolls made of birch bark. They had seen some birch bark writing, and they knew that Nokomis would etch pictures into bark too. She also knew where certain marks had been placed upon lake rocks long ago. Some of the marks were made by the spirits, some were made by humans, others were drawn by a giant race of people who had lived on Earth in the old days and had disappeared. Angeline's description of the white man's tracks interested Omakayas, in spite of herself. The system sounded incredible. Sounds, meanings, but the idea made sense. Thereafter, to learn the letters and sounds became a source of amusement, for the evenings were still long. "I," said Angeline, tracing the letter on the rough stone of the hearth. "A," said Omakayas. "B, C, D." She learned to make the pictures, and she learned to make the sounds slowly, all of them. Words would follow, Angeline said, but Omakayas could not believe that would happen. She remembered that last winter, before the sickness began, she had seen Fishtail walking from the mission school. Had he learned to make the white man's tracks? Had he learned to write his name? Had he learned to read the words of the treaties so that his people could not be cheated of land? "Bonjour," called Fishtail one day. He was at the door of the cabin, calling hello to his relatives. Grandma greeted him kindly, for he was ashamed of his thinness and weakness. That's from the sickness, of course. She brought him inside. His hair was short and wild as porcupine quills, his face starved and sallow with grief. No longer did he wear the proud, somewhat disdainful look he'd worn when walking seriously along through the woods, his pipe cradled in his arms. He was still hawk keen, with a strong and handsome face, but his eyes were more human, humble, gentle. He gazed pityingly down at Omakayas and touched her hair. "Little frog," he said, and there was a hint of smile in his voice, as though to see her brought him comfort. "My good wife loved you as her little sister. You made her laugh with your quick ways. She told me you were much loved by the bear people. She told me also that you had a bird named Ande." "Ande!" called Omakayas, and like a dark arrow, her crow swooped down and landed on her shoulder. Ande looked curiously at Fishtail, wondering whether he possibly had something to feed him. The bird danced from foot to foot, took a strand of Omakayas' hair in his beak, but didn't pull. Ande tucked the hair behind Omakayas' ear, just like a grandfather soothing a child to sleep. "Oh, ah," said Fishtail in wonder, "you are much beloved by the creatures." Over his shoulder, Fishtail carried a blanket, meaning that he had much to say and planned to spend the night. Day greeted him, holding him by the arms, and Nokomi stirred up the fire, adding a stick there, a bit of wood in exactly the right spot to make it blaze up cheerfully. Mama had made a good stew, filled with flaky chunks of fish, and the kettle bubbled hot, hung above the hearth fire. Fishtail took off his big moose hide mitts, and Angeline dished up a wooden bowl of the soup, eager for him to sit and warm himself. Because he was related as a cross cousin, and also because he had been the husband of her friend, she was familiar around him and not shy at all. She tried to cheer him up, to bring a smile to his face by teasing him gently. "Day needs snowshoes all winter, but you," Angeline pointed, "already have yours on, eh?" Fishtail gave a little smile, but there was still too much sadness in him to laugh. He waggled his feet. They were big, it was true. Almost as big as snowshoes, as big as Old Tallow's huge long ones. They come in handy," Fishtail acknowledged. "If I lose a paddle, I've always got one attached." He took great gulps of the fish broth, and slowly, feeling better, he warmed to the talk with Day Day. They were planning this year's sugaring, a time when everyone looked forward with joy and excitement, as much as ricing, maybe even more. For when the maple sap began to run, it meant that warmer days, pleasant sun, all the beauties of spring were close at hand. This sweetness just at the raggedy end of winter. Nokomis was as excited as a girl, and her enthusiasm made everyone smile. But the Creator expects us to be ready while you talk. Work! She herself was smoothing out a paddle to use in stirring the syrup, and just the day before, Day Day had started hollowing a peeled, smooth piece of basswood for a trough. Now Day Day asked for the use of Omakayas' gun barrel flesher. She brought it quickly from its place in the corner. She was glad to find another use for Day Day's gift, besides the usual unpleasant one of scraping hides. Taking the hide flesher in his hands, Day Day sharpened the end well on his sharpening stone. Holding the barrel in his strong fingers like a chisel, he hit the other end with his mallet, tapping long slices of wood away from the inside of the log. Every strip of wood he tapped from the inside, Pinch grabbed and threw into the fire. The trough grew smoother and deeper. Fishtail, meanwhile, smoked peacefully and looked into the leaping flames. You get to work too, Angeline said, smiling. She tossed him a bit of venison jerky, though for him to chew on when he finished smoking. The family sugaring place was at the other end of the island. When they traveled to the sugar bush, the family packed as lightly as possible. Once they arrived, they would use the frames set up last year for their big sugaring house. There was a smaller wigwam where the tools were stored, and there usually was a food cache buried last fall, filled with good things that had lain far beneath the snow. But this year, Day Day had already made a trip to the end of the island and raided the cache to keep from starving. They had already eaten their store. When they arrived, the first thing Mama did was unroll the reed mats from the roof of the shelter, then the blankets, then take out new paddles and the cooking pot. Day Day dragged a big kettle and more wooden troughs and paddles from the storage house. Anything that wasn't at the sugaring place or anything that broke or wore out, they could make for themselves. Nokomis and Omakayas arranged the food they'd brought. There were packets of split dried fish, a makuk of special powdered fish, moose meat, a little mannamin traded for with deer meat, smoked fish, and a bag of dried pumpkin flowers to thicken soups. Neshki, said Nokomis, happy they had so much. We'll have a good feast. Once a soup was in the making, Nokomis left Angeline to stir and called Omakayas to come along and help chop taps to open the maples. The two wandered a bit until Nokomis found a good ironwood tree. She took out her sharp hatchet and expertly chopped into the tree at angles. She made a series of perfect cuts down the side of the tree, and then chopped sideways and split from the tree 10 perfect wedges of the hard ironwood. She did this until she had a huge sack full of wedges, which Omakayas lugged back to the camp. For 2 days they prepared, knowing that the sap was just about to start running. There was a feeling to that time, before the sap began, a quietness that had the going out taste of winter. All that happened in the snow and cold, the storytelling and the sadness too, was left behind. Omakayas opened herself to the warming wind. Before them, the sweetness of the maple waited, the warmth of the sun. Omakayas, Twilight, and Little Bee carted heavy rocks from the lakeshore to weigh down the makuks, and then hauled wood for the fire. Omakayas' arms were tired, and her cousin's arms were tired too. They complained impatiently to each other as they hunted for the right sized stones and hauled load after load of wood in their arms, dumping it near the big kettle, which was boiling and steaming away. As yet, not one taste of the maple syrup, just the cold, sweet sap. It was always this way before the first taste. The boiling down seemed to take so endlessly long. Pinch watched jealously, jumped on a log to observe Grandma's paddle when it came up and dipped back down again. Still not ready. Still not. Still not. Then ready. Onto the surface of a big muckuk filled with clean snow, Grandma dribbled a thin, dark gold stream of syrup. Pinch could hardly wait for it to cool. Gum sugar! He grabbed while it was still a soft rope, swung the strand into his mouth, and ran, for once quiet instead of yelling, only because his mouth was stuffed. Ande was caught up in the excitement, and he jumped from foot to foot, nearly tumbling from Omakayas' shoulder as Angeline poured out more syrup and then helped Grandma ladle the rest into a sugaring trough. He pecked at a bit of the syrup, but didn't seem to like the sticky feel of it on his beak, and shook his head comically. He put his head in the snow, wiped his beak back and forth, but couldn't remove the hardening syrup. He flew up to a low branch and glared down at them, betrayed, preening his feathers, making his feathers sticky with the syrup too. The first taste usually made Omakaya smile. Not this time. Sadness overwhelmed her when she tasted the sweetness. She instantly recalled the special day she spent with Niwo on the shore of the lake. On that day, long ago last summer, she had freed him from the tight bonds of his noggin, let him tumble and play. When it came time for her to put him back, she'd sweetened his confinement by placing her last bit of sugar on his tongue. "Chickadee, my brother," she cried to Niwo under her breath. She looked around. Pinch was running and jumping, striking out with a stick and pretending to hunt doves. Nokomis was stirring the syrup, using a dancing kind of smooth movement with her arms. Mama was putting together a stew, and Dede was off somewhere with Fishtail, planning ceremonies that would be held during the sugaring. Angeline looked at her and said, "Neshame, go get some more wood." She, Omakayas, was the only one thinking of Niwo. The knowledge made her lonely. If only she could talk to him, look into his cheerful, upslanted eyes, share with him her feelings that he never laughed at, play with him in her arms. She missed him terribly, so much so that her heart seemed to drop right through her stomach with a thud. Muffling her cries, she ran from camp straight into the woods. Angeline was surprised. Usually, her sister did not fetch wood with such enthusiasm. Omakais knew that she would not come back, and Angeline could fetch her own wood. She ran with an angry heart, breathing hard, skimming away as fast as she could. She got away from everyone before she sat down on a little patch of dry, sunny ground. At last, it was right to sob and sob, to let herself cry as much as she wanted to. But the strange thing was, as soon as she sat down, she didn't feel like crying anymore. She heard the song of the white-throated sparrow and was soothed by the piercing refrain. And she smiled. Niwo's spirit was comforting her. Her eyelids got heavy. The sun warmed her, and she was just about lost in a dream when she was startled by the crackle of sticks and twigs, the shuffle of feet, the interested snuffling, and most of all, the commanding and unmistakable odor of bear. They were with her. Standing quietly at the edge of the little spot of sun, the two young bears gazed curiously, knowingly at Omakayas. Ande flew down suddenly, as though he, the little crow, had to protect her from her brothers. The two bears, startled a bit at the crow's angry charge, but then shrugged and ignored him. "It's okay," said Omakayas, and Ande returned to her shoulder. The bears continued to look closely at Omakayas, peering with their dim bear eyes, taking in every dot of her scent, remembering it all and knowing. Omakayas wished that she had something to give them. She had run away from camp with nothing more than a handful of spirit tobacco in her pocket. They kept looking at her, waiting and watching. The only thing she could think of to give them in the end was some human advice. She decided to warn them about other humans and the dangers they posed. "There's a woman," Omakayas said softly. "Her name is Old Tallow. She's my aunt, but you must stay away from her." The young bear's ears twitched a little. They seemed to listen closely. "Be careful, too," Omakayas went on. "When you see something better to eat than usual out in the woods, if it's hanging up out of reach, there might be a pit underneath. That's a trap. You'll fall in and die. And guns, my brothers, run fast from men carrying big sticks on their shoulders. Stay away from them. Don't go near the humans, either the Anishinabeg or the Shimukamanag. Stay deep in the woods. Hide if you hear Old Tallow's dogs." Omakayas reached into her pocket and took out a little handful of tobacco. She put the tobacco on the ground. When she did, she knew she was asking for something, but she wasn't sure what it was. Words she had not expected came from her lips. "Will you give me your medicine?" She asked this, but her voice was uncertain. She really didn't know what it meant. She felt embarrassed at herself. "I'm pitiful," she said, just as her grandmother did sometimes when praying. "I don't know anything. I want to know your medicine. I want to be like Nokomis. I want strong medicines to save my family." Tears came into Omakaya's eyes, and she could hardly see, hardly noticed when the bears wheeled and silently disappeared. "Help me," she whispered to the ground. "Help me." Once she'd finished talking, she lifted her face and looked around. Her bear brothers had vanished, and she felt better. She set to work gathering a huge load of dry sticks, dead branches torn off during the winter by heavy snow and ice. As she was piling the branches higher and higher, she saw, on the side of a dry piece of birchwood, the gray hoof of a mushroom. A tiny voice whispered in her head, a low voice muttering. When she picked up the branch, the voice grew louder, but she still couldn't make out individual words. She added the branch to her pile, bound the pile with a thong, and carried it back to the camp on her shoulders. From time to time, as she walked back to camp through the woods, she heard a small sound, a word or two, muffled under the snow and leaves. By the time she reached the sugaring camp, she felt a bit afraid. What were these voices? What did the whispering mean? Standing on the clearing, safe, she peered into the maze of branches and undergrowth. Shining scraps of snow lighted the ground as far as she could see. The sounds of voices, small and whispery, still floated from the depth of the woods. "What took you so long?" Angeline said, a bit annoyed. She'd burned her finger in the process of pouring some hot syrup, and she was hurting badly. "What's wrong with you?" Omakayas put down her load and told her sister that she had something important to do. "So do I," Angeline yelled back. We won't read the rest of this together. If your family didn't get a copy yet, come on in the library. We have several copies for you, or ebooks, or you can check out the audiobook. I have really enjoyed reading with you about Omakayas, even when I didn't know how to pronounce some of the words. I hope you're having a wonderful day and come see us at the library.